Well, welcome to this week's Gospel study video, and this week I'm preaching on the story of a double miracle which Jesus performed during his journeys through the region of Galilee, which is located around the Sea of Galilee. In the Gospel for last week, Jesus had a rather eventful trip across the sea to the eastern shore to an area called the Decapolis, which is Greek for the 10 cities. These were 10 towns or cities in the area inhabited by Greek-speaking people and not Jews like Jesus. Then, after spending some time in that area, a stay marked by a remarkable healing of a man possessed by demons who was living in a cemetery, Jesus again sailed back across the sea. We're not told exactly where he landed, but he's back in Jewish territories. And once more, he was followed by the crowds who were eager to get a glimpse of and hear from this now famous teacher and miracle worker. Back on shore, Jesus was met by a man named Jairus. He was the leader at a Jewish synagogue or house of worship in that area. And Jairus fell at Jesus' feet and he begged him to come with him. "My little daughter is at the point of death," he said. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and leave." Jairus had obviously heard of Jesus' healing powers and desperately came to him for help. Jesus went with him. There's no further conversation recorded in the gospel story. Jesus just goes with him. However, his journey was interrupted. A large crowd followed Jesus and Jairus, probably pushing in on them and jostling them as they tried to make their way to Jairus' house. And in the crowd was a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. Now, we're not told exactly what this was, but it's important to note that such a bleeding like this would make the woman unclean in the eyes of the cleanliness laws of the Jews found in the Torah, their scriptures. This would keep her from coming to worship or being in contact with others, since contamination by blood was taboo in Judaism. Keep that in mind as the story goes along. The gospel writer tells us that the woman had suffered greatly from her affliction, both from the condition and also from the treatments by the doctors, which took much of her money but did not offer her any relief. In fact, the gospel writer tells us that the doctor's treatments only made her worse. But this woman had hope in Jesus. She's quoted as saying to herself, "But if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." There are no other stories in Mark's gospel about people being made well just by touching Jesus, touching his body, much less his clothing. Jesus hadn't talked about this, nor had he encouraged actions like this. But somehow the woman thought it. Just one touch of Jesus, even if it were his cloak, and she would be healed by his power. So, as the crowd surrounds Jesus on his way to Jairus' house, she came up behind him and touched his cloak. And she was healed immediately. The gospel writer tells us her hemorrhage stopped and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Jesus felt something as well. In a strange phrase, Mark says, "Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around." Now, do not ask me to explain that to you, Grace members. Did Jesus experience some sort of electrical-like jolt as some of his divine energy left him and went into the woman's body to heal her? I don't know, and Mark doesn't tell us. The key thing is that Jesus realized something had happened and that someone had touched him in a way that this person had been healed. Jesus stopped and turned to the crowd. "Who touched my clothes?" he asked. He looked around. He may have felt the power go out of him, but he doesn't know who it is who has touched him. That would have been an interesting scene as the crowd all stopped and looked bewildered at one another. Was Jesus angry, they may have asked themselves? Was someone so presumptuous that they dared to invade the personal space of the miracle worker, they may have thought? Again, we don't know. But the woman, knowing she'd been found out, came forward full of fear and trembling. "What have I done? Oh, I'm in for it now. I made the teacher mad." Or did she ask herself, "Is Jesus angry at me because I dared to touch him and I made him unclean as well?" Is that what's running through her mind? It's a case of I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. She fell down before Jesus, just as Jairus had done, and confessed what she had done. But instead of getting angry and yelling at her, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." What a wave of relief she must have felt. I've often wondered what the crowd thought at Jesus' words. After all, saying something like that when you're surrounded by an adoring crowd of followers, it might be an invitation to be overwhelmed by the loving mob. But we're not given time to ponder that, because while Jesus was still speaking, people arrived from Jairus' house with the devastating news, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Jairus must have been heartbroken. I wonder if he also wasn't angry at that woman who had dared interrupt their life and death journey to his house, the woman whose own healing had taken precious time and left his daughter dead. I also wonder if he may not have been angry at Jesus, angry at him for stopping and talking to the woman. Was it really that big a deal that he had to find out who touched him? Who cared? His own daughter was dying. However, again, Jesus interrupted and intervened. "Do not fear," he said, "only believe." Words quite similar to those he had said the night before to his disciples in the boat after he had stilled the wind and the waves, when he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Once again, in the midst of fear and threatening loss, Jesus offered words of hope. Forbidding anyone else to follow except for his disciples Peter, James, and John, Jesus left the bewildered crowd behind and went to Jairus' house. And when they arrived there, they found people weeping and wailing loudly, mourning the little girl's death. The inhabitants of the Middle East to this day are still known for their loud and demonstrative ways of showing grief. But Jesus would have none of this. "Why do you make a commotion and weep?" he demanded them. I wondered if their tears and cries came to a shocking halt at these words, and they stared wide-eyed at Jesus. "The child is not dead, but sleeping," he continued. And these words were not met with wails or tears, but with laughter. They knew the child was dead. What was wrong with this man that he could be so foolish? Again, Jesus would have none of this. He ordered them all out of the house. The Greek text almost makes it sound like he's the one pushing the scoffing mourners out the door. And Jesus took Jairus, his wife, and his 3 disciples with him into the room where the girl's body lay. He took her by the hand. Again, touching is involved, although this time Jesus initiates it. He took her by the hand, and he said in his native tongue, in the language of Aramaic, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." This is one of just a handful of verses in the gospel where we hear Jesus speak his own Aramaic language and don't get the Greek version of his words. "Little girl, get up." And immediately, that's one of Mark's favorite words. We heard it when the woman touched Jesus' cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Immediately the little girl got up and began to walk around. At this, they were overcome with amazement, the gospel says. I should say so. Jesus told them to give the girl something to eat. And in this, I think there might be an echo to a story back in Mark 1, when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law when she was sick in bed and with a fever. And when she was healed, she got up and gave food to her guest. Talk about being the hostess with the mostess. But in this story, Jesus orders food to be given to the girl. He also did something else. He ordered those in the room to tell no one of what had happened. This is something that happens elsewhere in the gospel. Back in chapter 1, when Jesus healed the leper, he told the leper, "See that you say nothing to anyone." When he healed the deaf man in chapter 8, the gospel says, then Jesus ordered them to tell no one about it. This sort of saying by Jesus is sometimes referred to as being part of the messianic secret. Jesus did not proclaim his deeds because he didn't want to be known as simply someone who did miracles. While he cared for people and helped out all who reached out to him, he was not simply the one who came to wow people with miracles and mighty deeds. Such things might be impressive, but Jesus knew, and this is important, Jesus knew that they seldom led to true faith and devotion to him. Jesus would reveal himself as Messiah in another way. He would do so by his suffering and death. That is from where his true glory would come. So he often told people to keep quiet about what he had done, or if they needed to give someone glory, to give it to God and not him. This small sentence from Jesus' lips speaks volumes about who he was and what he came to do. And as I preach this week about being generous people, Jesus' amazing generosity and love for others serves as our models for how we are to live. So thank you for joining me for this week's gospel video. I hope we will see you in worship this week, or you will watch us online as well.